The most expensive mistake my homeowners association ever made started with a $400 fee they insisted I had to pay, and ended with a question nobody thought to ask until it was far too late. Why had that old dam been there in the first place? My name is Nathan Brooks, and for more than 20 years I worked as a civil engineer specializing in water management projects across Central Texas. My career never made headlines, and I preferred it that way. Good infrastructure is supposed to disappear into everyday life. When it works, nobody notices. When it fails, everyone suddenly becomes an expert. That lesson followed me into retirement when I bought a quiet property just outside a growing residential development about 30 miles northwest of Austin. The land wasn't extravagant. It covered just under 5 acres with a modest house, a small pond, and an old earthen dam stretching across a narrow creek that only looked ordinary if you didn't understand how water moved through the landscape. County survey records showed some version of that dam had existed long before the subdivision was built. Previous owners had maintained it. I continued doing the same. Every spring I inspected the spillway, cleared debris, checked erosion, and kept careful maintenance records because old habits never really disappear. Most of my neighbors only saw a peaceful pond reflecting the evening sky. I saw elevations, drainage paths, and decades of engineering decisions layered beneath the surface. Life stayed pleasantly uneventful until the Homeowners Association decided it needed another source of revenue. The board announced updated compliance fees covering inspections, administrative processing, and several new categories of architectural review. $400 wasn't enough to change my finances, but the letter attached to the invoice caught my attention. According to the notice, my property contained an unapproved structure requiring immediate compliance review. I assumed they had made a clerical mistake. After all, nobody builds a dam without leaving records, especially one that had appeared on county maps for decades. I gathered my property survey, purchase documents, maintenance logs, and archived aerial photographs before calling the HOA office. The receptionist scheduled me for a compliance meeting the following week. I expected a straightforward conversation. Instead, I met Victoria Langford. You probably know someone like her. She walked into the conference room wearing a brightly patterned designer jacket, oversized gold jewelry, and carrying a leather binder thick enough to suggest every answer had already been printed before anyone asked a question. Victoria was a large woman with an unmistakable confidence that filled every corner of the room. She smiled often, but it was the kind of practiced smile that never invited discussion. She believed rules created order, and more importantly, she believed she alone understood those rules better than anyone else. She thanked me for arriving on time, complimented my organization after seeing the stack of documents I'd brought, and then calmly explained that none of them changed the board's preliminary conclusion. My dam, according to the association, did not match current architectural standards and would either require formal approval through a costly review process or removal. I asked whether anyone had compared their findings with county records. Victoria answered that historical conditions did not automatically establish present compliance. I asked whether a licensed engineer had evaluated the drainage system before recommending structural changes. She replied that architectural consistency fell within HOA authority. Every answer circled back to policy while carefully avoiding the engineering question sitting in the middle of the table. I left that meeting with my paperwork untouched and a growing sense that the discussion had never really been about $400. The fee was simply the doorway. The real issue was that someone had looked at an old dam, decided it appeared unnecessary, and assumed appearances told the whole story. Driving home that afternoon, I glanced across the pond shimmering beneath the Texas sun and remembered something an older engineer had told me during my first year in the profession. He said the most dangerous assumption in water management was believing today's calm conditions explained yesterday's decisions. At the time, I thought he was talking about engineering. Years later, I realized he had also been talking about people. I just didn't know how expensive that lesson was about to become. When I arrived home after that meeting, I resisted the temptation to respond immediately. Experience had taught me that the first reaction is rarely the best one, especially when documentation is involved. I carried every folder into my study, spread the papers across my desk, and started arranging them in chronological order. My original purchase agreement went on the left. County survey maps followed. Maintenance records came next. Then came photographs I had taken every spring for nearly a decade, showing the condition of the spillway, the creek, and the surrounding embankment. Looking at everything together, I felt reassured that the facts were on my side. What I did not understand, yet, was that facts only matter when someone is willing to examine them. The following morning, I called the county recorder's office and requested archived property records dating back before the subdivision existed. The employee who answered sounded genuinely helpful. She explained that many older surveys had already been digitized and promised to email copies later that afternoon. By 3 o'clock, my inbox contained several scanned maps showing the same earthen structure appearing on property records created decades before the Homeowners Association had ever been established. That alone did not prove the dam still served an important purpose, but it certainly demonstrated that it had not been built recently or hidden from public records. Encouraged by those documents, I drafted a respectful letter to the association. I attached copies of the surveys, highlighted the historical references, and politely requested that the board postpone any compliance action until an independent engineering review could determine whether removing the structure might affect local drainage. I chose every word carefully because I wanted cooperation, not confrontation. 2 days later, I received Victoria Langford's response. She thanked me for my professionalism, confirmed that every attachment had been received, and informed me that the board had completed its preliminary review. Then came the sentence that immediately caught my attention. She wrote that historical documentation did not exempt any structure from current architectural compliance standards. There was no mention of engineering, no mention of drainage, no mention of water management. My request for technical evaluation had quietly disappeared beneath another reference to appearance standards. I read the message twice before closing my laptop. At that moment, I realized we were participating in two entirely different conversations. I believed we were discussing infrastructure. The board believed they were discussing neighborhood aesthetics. A few days later, another certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. This one included a revised compliance schedule, additional administrative fees, and a reminder that failure to resolve the matter could result in escalating penalties under association rules. The total amount remained relatively small compared to what I had seen during my professional career, but the dollar figure was becoming less important than the principle behind it. Every letter assumed the dam was simply another unauthorized feature that could be removed without consequence. That assumption bothered me far more than the invoice itself. Hoping for an outside perspective, I contacted an engineer I had worked with years earlier on several county drainage projects. His name was David Mercer, and he had spent most of his career evaluating flood control systems throughout Central Texas. I explained the situation from beginning to end without exaggerating anything. David listened quietly before asking a single question that nobody from the association had asked. He wanted to know where the water went during unusually heavy storms. I smiled because that was exactly the right question. I invited him to visit the property the following weekend. We walked the creek together for nearly 2 hours, measuring elevations with simple field equipment and comparing what we saw with the historical surveys I had collected. David never rushed to conclusions. Instead, he observed the terrain, examined the spillway, and studied the natural drainage patterns extending beyond my property line. Before leaving, he looked back toward the pond and said something that stayed with me long afterward. He told me he was not prepared to say the dam absolutely had to remain, but he was equally unwilling to recommend removing it without a comprehensive hydrological study. Water, he reminded me, has a remarkable way of exposing assumptions people make when they believe they already understand the landscape. His opinion was careful, measured, and exactly what I had hoped the association would want to hear. I immediately forwarded his written recommendation to Victoria along with another polite request asking the board to pause enforcement until qualified specialists could complete a proper evaluation. The reply arrived less than 24 hours later. Victoria thanked me once again for my cooperation, acknowledged David's professional background, and explained that because he had not been retained by the association, his recommendation would not alter the existing compliance timeline. Reading those words left me staring out across the still water behind my house, wondering how many important decisions had already been made by people who never stopped long enough to ask why that old dam had survived for so many decades in the first place. Over the next week, I noticed something changing that had nothing to do with paperwork. The official letters continued arriving exactly on schedule, each one professionally written, carefully formatted, and remarkably consistent in its conclusion. Every document acknowledged that I had submitted evidence. Every document confirmed that the board had reviewed my materials. Every document ended by reaffirming the same compliance deadline without addressing the engineering questions I had raised. It was as though the discussion itself had become a checklist rather than a conversation. I refused to let frustration dictate my decisions. Instead, I focused on gathering information that could either support my concerns or prove me wrong. Engineering had taught me long ago that confidence without verification was simply another form of assumption. One Saturday morning, I walked the entire length of the creek carrying a notebook, a laser measuring tool, and copies of the old survey maps. I compared elevations, photographed drainage channels, and marked places where runoff naturally spread during heavy rain. The surrounding landscape told a story that was easy to overlook unless someone took the time to study it. The creek narrowed before reaching my property, widened behind the earthen dam, then continued through a series of shallow drainage corridors crossing land that had gradually become residential neighborhoods over several decades. Nothing about that pattern automatically proved the dam remained essential, but it reinforced my belief that removing it deserved careful evaluation rather than administrative approval. While I was finishing my notes, my next-door neighbor, Harold Simmons, drove by in his pickup and stopped to ask what I was measuring. Harold had lived in the area much longer than I had, and unlike many newer residents, he remembered what the land looked like before the subdivision expanded. When I explained the situation, he became noticeably quieter. He told me he remembered county maintenance crews occasionally inspecting the creek many years ago, although he could not recall the exact reason. He also remembered older residents referring to the pond as part of the area's natural drainage rather than simply a decorative water feature. Harold emphasized that he was not an engineer and did not know whether those memories still mattered, but he thought they were worth mentioning. His comments encouraged me to continue searching through historical records instead of relying solely on my own observations. A few days later, another homeowners association meeting took place. I decided to attend even though my issue was not formally listed on the agenda. Victoria Langford stood at the front of the room wearing another brightly colored designer outfit with oversized jewelry that reflected the lights every time she turned toward the audience. She carried herself with complete confidence, greeting residents warmly and moving through routine business with impressive efficiency. Listening to her, I understood why many homeowners appreciated her leadership. She sounded organized, prepared, and completely certain of every decision she presented. That confidence made what happened next even more surprising. During the homeowner comment period, I politely asked whether the board would consider delaying enforcement until an independent hydrological assessment could be completed. I made it clear that I was not asking for special treatment. I simply believed that permanent changes involving long-standing drainage features deserved technical review before irreversible decisions were made. Victoria thanked me for my respectful approach, smiled, and responded that the association's responsibility was maintaining compliance with neighborhood standards, not conducting engineering investigations. She explained that if every architectural concern required extensive outside consultation, enforcement would become inconsistent and inefficient. Several board members nodded in agreement without adding further discussion. I realized then that the disagreement was no longer about evidence. It was about perspective. The board viewed the dam as a structure affecting neighborhood appearance. I viewed it as part of a larger water management system that happened to exist on private property. Those two viewpoints never actually met. After the meeting, several neighbors quietly approached me in the parking lot. None of them openly criticized the association, but a few admitted they had assumed the issue involved an ordinary landscaping violation until they heard me describe the historical surveys and engineering concerns. One resident even asked whether the county had ever documented why the dam was originally built. That simple question stayed with me during the drive home because despite weeks of correspondence, nobody from the association had ever asked it. They wanted to know whether the structure complied with present rules. I wanted to know why generations before us believed it belonged there in the first place. The difference between those two questions seemed small at first, but I had a growing feeling that everything which followed would eventually depend on the answer. By the beginning of the following week, the compliance deadline no longer felt like a distant administrative date sitting quietly on a calendar. Every morning I walked outside with my coffee, looked across the pond, and wondered whether I had overlooked something that could still persuade the board to pause. I reviewed every survey one more time, reread every email, and even called the county planning office hoping someone there might identify a procedural step I had missed. The employee I spoke with listened patiently before explaining that disagreements involving private homeowners associations generally remained outside the county's direct authority unless another regulatory issue was involved. She encouraged me to preserve every document and every piece of correspondence because complete records often became valuable later, even when they could not solve the immediate problem. It was sensible advice, but it did not change the reality that the deadline continued moving closer. I spent the next several evenings organizing everything into clearly labeled folders. Historical surveys, maintenance logs, engineering photographs, weather records, correspondence with the association, and David Mercer's written recommendation all found their place inside a large storage box. My professional instinct kept telling me that facts eventually mattered, even when they appeared to accomplish very little in the present. Around the same time, Harold stopped by again while I was clearing leaves from a drainage channel near the creek. He asked whether the association had finally agreed to bring in an independent engineer. When I shook my head, he looked genuinely disappointed. He admitted that several neighbors had begun discussing the situation among themselves because many had assumed there would eventually be some technical review before permanent changes were approved. Instead, all anyone seemed to hear about was compliance deadlines and architectural standards. Harold quietly remarked that people often became too confident when they believed paperwork answered every question. His observation stayed with me long after he drove away. A few days later, I met with an attorney who specialized in property disputes involving homeowners associations. I carried 2 boxes of documents into his office and spent nearly an hour explaining everything from the historical surveys to the engineering recommendation. After reviewing the material, he leaned back in his chair and gave me an answer I had not wanted to hear. He believed my concerns deserved serious consideration, but he also explained that obtaining emergency legal relief before the compliance deadline could require significant time, uncertain outcomes, and expenses that would likely exceed the amount originally at issue. He emphasized that he was not advising me to surrender my position. He was simply explaining the practical realities of litigation. Driving home afterward, I found myself thinking less about winning an argument and more about the difficult balance between principle and practicality. I had spent my career encouraging clients to make decisions supported by evidence instead of emotion. Now I faced that same challenge myself. Continuing to resist could easily become more expensive than complying while preserving every piece of documentation for whatever came next. That evening I stood beside the pond as the setting sun reflected across the calm water. Nothing about the landscape suggested urgency. Birds crossed overhead. The breeze barely disturbed the surface. It looked exactly as it had every evening since I purchased the property. Yet I knew appearances could be deceptive. Quiet systems often performed their most important work without attracting attention. Early the next morning, I called the excavation contractor listed on the association's approved vendor list. His name was Michael Turner, and before discussing schedules or equipment, I asked whether he would be willing to visit the property before making any commitments. He agreed without hesitation. When Michael arrived later that afternoon, he surprised me by spending nearly an hour walking the creek instead of immediately examining the earthen dam. He studied the surrounding terrain, paused several times to observe the natural drainage, and asked thoughtful questions about seasonal runoff. Finally, he turned toward me and spoke with the careful tone of someone who understood the limits of his own expertise. He explained that while he could certainly perform excavation work if instructed, he would personally feel more comfortable seeing a comprehensive engineering assessment before altering a long-standing drainage feature. His words echoed David Mercer's earlier recommendation almost exactly. I thanked him for his honesty, knowing that 2 independent professionals had now reached remarkably similar conclusions. Even so, the official compliance deadline remained unchanged, and for the first time since receiving that original notice, I began preparing myself for the possibility that careful documentation alone might not be enough to prevent what was about to happen. The compliance deadline arrived on a clear Thursday morning that felt strangely ordinary. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, and walked to the pond one more time. The surface reflected the pale morning sky exactly as it had hundreds of times before. Standing there, I found myself thinking about how many years this quiet place had existed without drawing anyone's attention. It was only after someone decided it did not belong that every conversation suddenly revolved around it. Michael Turner arrived shortly after 9 o'clock with a small crew and a pickup carrying the equipment needed for the work. Before unloading anything, he walked over to shake my hand. He did not look eager to begin. Instead, he looked thoughtful. He quietly asked whether there had been any change from the association or whether an engineering review had finally been approved. I told him nothing had changed. Every request had been acknowledged, every recommendation had been received, and every deadline had remained exactly the same. Michael nodded slowly before saying that he still believed a technical evaluation would have been the wiser course. Even so, he had been hired to perform the work authorized by the property owner, and he intended to complete it as carefully as possible. I appreciated his honesty. Throughout my career, I had worked with contractors who understood the difference between following instructions and pretending to know more than they actually did. Before any equipment moved, I photographed every section of the dam from multiple angles. I recorded short videos showing the pond level, the spillway, the surrounding creek, and the drainage channels extending beyond my property. I even included the date and weather conditions in my notes. Some people later asked why I spent so much time documenting everything instead of simply getting the project over with. The answer was simple. Engineers learned that today's ordinary conditions often become tomorrow's most valuable evidence. As work began, the process unfolded much more quietly than I had imagined. There was no dramatic moment and no sense of celebration. Soil was gradually relocated according to the agreed plan, while water slowly adjusted to the changing path available to it. Michael monitored the work carefully, pausing several times to verify elevations and avoid unnecessary disturbance outside the immediate area. Watching the familiar landscape change felt less like losing an argument and more like watching an old chapter quietly close. Around midday, Harold stopped by carrying 2 bottles of water for the crew. He stood beside me for several minutes without saying much. Finally, he looked toward the creek and admitted that he had hoped someone would step in before things reached this point. He reminded me again that older residents had always spoken about the pond as though it served a purpose beyond appearance, even if nobody could fully explain it anymore. I answered honestly that I hoped we had both been overly cautious. Perhaps the association had been right. Perhaps the historical records no longer mattered. Perhaps nothing significant would change at all. As an engineer, I wanted that outcome more than anyone because it would mean the landscape could safely adapt without unexpected consequences. By late afternoon, the work was complete. The equipment was loaded back onto the trucks, disturbed areas were graded, and temporary erosion protection was installed where appropriate. Michael handed me copies of the final paperwork before leaving. He paused one last time and encouraged me not to discard any of my documentation. He said that careful records had a way of becoming important when people later tried to understand how events unfolded. After everyone drove away, the property felt unusually quiet. The pond no longer looked quite the same, and the creek carried water along a noticeably different course than it had the week before. Nothing appeared alarming. In fact, anyone unfamiliar with the history might have assumed the area had always looked that way. I spent the remainder of the evening walking the property with my notebook, comparing current conditions against the photographs I had taken only hours earlier. Every observation was dated and carefully recorded. Before going inside, I checked the long-range weather forecast out of habit. A slow-moving storm system was expected to pass through central Texas within the next several days, bringing the first widespread rainfall the region had seen in weeks. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have welcomed the forecast without a second thought. This time I found myself looking back toward the creek just a little longer than usual, quietly wondering whether the landscape would respond exactly as everyone expected once the rain finally arrived. The rain arrived 3 days later exactly as the forecast had predicted. It was not an extraordinary storm by Central Texas standards, and that was the first detail that caught my attention. During my career, I had evaluated drainage systems after hurricanes, flash floods, and record-breaking rainfall. This weather event was different. Steady showers moved across the area for most of the afternoon, dropping enough water to thoroughly soak the ground without producing the kind of totals that normally made evening news headlines. From the front porch, I watched the creek begin to respond exactly as any healthy watershed would. Water levels rose gradually, runoff collected along shallow drainage paths, and the familiar sound of flowing water returned to the property. At first, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Then I noticed something I had never seen before. Instead of spreading into the broad area where the pond had once slowed and redirected part of the flow, the creek accelerated through the newly opened channel much earlier than it had in previous years. The water itself was not especially deep, but its movement looked noticeably different. I retrieved my notebook, my camera, and the photographs I had taken immediately before the excavation. Standing in nearly the same locations, I began documenting every visible change. The comparison revealed subtle differences that would have escaped almost anyone unfamiliar with the property. Areas that had previously remained calm now carried faster-moving water. Small drainage swales filled more quickly than I remembered. Along one section near the property boundary, I noticed fresh erosion where the soil had remained stable for years. None of it looked catastrophic, but all of it deserved attention. Later that evening, Harold called and asked whether I had noticed unusual runoff near the road connecting several neighboring properties. He explained that water had collected in a low section of the shoulder much sooner than residents expected. Public Works crews had already placed temporary warning signs while they evaluated the drainage. I drove over the following morning after the rain had ended. The road remained open, and there was no emergency, but county employees were measuring watermarks, examining roadside ditches, and taking photographs. One of the technicians recognized me from previous engineering projects years earlier. After a brief conversation, he admitted they were trying to understand why runoff patterns looked different from historical observations recorded for that location. I deliberately avoided offering conclusions. Instead, I simply mentioned that significant changes had recently occurred upstream and suggested they review every relevant factor before reaching any determination. He appreciated the comment and wrote something in his field notebook. By that afternoon, I received another call, this time from Michael Turner. He had heard that county personnel were inspecting drainage areas downstream and wanted to know whether everything was all right. I described exactly what I had observed without exaggeration. Michael listened quietly before saying something that immediately reminded me why I respected experienced contractors. He explained that changing even a modest water control feature sometimes produced consequences that only became visible after the first meaningful rainfall. That did not automatically mean anyone had made a mistake, but it did mean the landscape was responding to a different set of conditions than before. His explanation matched my own observations almost perfectly. The following morning, I opened my email and found a community notice from the Homeowners Association. Residents were informed that county representatives had been seen evaluating several drainage locations following recent rainfall, and that the association was cooperating with any routine inquiries. The message presented the inspections as ordinary post-storm activity, and perhaps at that moment they truly were. Even so, I found it interesting that the association now considered drainage important enough to mention after weeks of insisting the discussion centered only on architectural compliance. Later that day, I returned to the creek carrying every set of photographs I had taken before and after the excavation. Comparing them side by side, I realized the differences formed a consistent pattern rather than isolated observations. Water had not become dangerous. It had simply begun choosing different paths across the landscape. As an engineer, I knew that drainage systems often reveal their behavior one storm at a time, each rainfall adding another piece to a much larger picture. Standing beside the creek that evening, I found myself thinking less about the disagreement with the Homeowners Association and more about the unanswered question that had started everything. If such modest rainfall could already produce measurable changes, what exactly had that old earthen dam been quietly doing all those years before anyone decided it was unnecessary? Over the next several days, the conversations throughout the neighborhood changed in a way I had not experienced since moving there. People were no longer asking why I had resisted the compliance notice. Instead, they were asking why county personnel had returned to the same drainage locations more than once after what everyone agreed had been a fairly ordinary rain event. Pickup trucks from different departments appeared along roadside ditches. Survey flags began showing up near culverts, and technicians carrying measuring equipment spent hours recording elevations instead of simply driving through and leaving. None of that proved there was a serious problem, but it demonstrated that someone believed the changes deserved careful study. I stayed out of their way and continued documenting everything on my own property. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The caller introduced herself as Laura Jenkins, a hydrologist working with the county engineering office. She explained that my name had come up after technicians learned I had previously worked in civil engineering and that historical drainage records referenced structures once located near my property. She asked whether I would be willing to meet with the review team and share any documentation I had collected over the years. I agreed immediately. The following morning, I arrived carrying the same storage boxes that had followed me through every meeting with the Homeowners Association. Laura greeted me with a firm handshake and introduced several other engineers and survey specialists. Unlike previous conversations, nobody entered the discussion assuming they already knew the answer. They began by asking questions. They wanted purchase records, maintenance photographs, historical surveys, weather observations, and anything else that might help establish how the creek had behaved before recent changes occurred. For nearly 3 hours, we reviewed maps dating back decades. One engineer overlaid modern aerial imagery onto archived county surveys, while another compared elevation data collected before the subdivision expanded. Slowly, a larger picture began emerging. The earthen structure that had existed on my property was never identified as a major flood control facility, but multiple historical documents consistently treated it as part of a broader local drainage system that slowed runoff before water continued downstream through interconnected channels. No single record declared it indispensable, yet none described it as merely decorative either. The pattern itself mattered. Laura explained that older rural infrastructure often evolved gradually over generations. Property owners maintained features because they worked, even if the original purpose became less obvious over time. As communities expanded, institutional knowledge sometimes disappeared while the structures themselves quietly continued performing the same function. Hearing that explanation felt strangely reassuring because it reflected exactly what had concerned me from the beginning. The issue had never been whether the dam looked attractive. The question was whether anyone had fully understood its role before deciding to remove it. Later that afternoon, Laura and 2 surveyors visited my property. We walked the creek together, stopping frequently while they compared current conditions against historical maps. They examined erosion patterns that had developed after the recent rainfall, measured new flow paths, and reviewed the photographs I had taken before and immediately after the excavation. Several times, they complimented the level of detail in my documentation. I smiled because those records had once seemed almost excessive, yet now they allowed every observation to be compared against real evidence instead of memory. Word of the county visit spread quickly through the neighborhood. Harold called that evening to tell me several residents had noticed the survey crews and wondered what was happening. I answered honestly that the engineers were still gathering information and that no conclusions had been reached. That distinction mattered. I had spent too much of this experience watching assumptions replace investigation, and I had no intention of repeating the same mistake from the opposite direction. 2 days later, another homeowners association email appeared in everyone's inbox. This time the tone felt noticeably different. Instead of emphasizing compliance procedures, the board informed residents that it would cooperate fully with county engineering staff while technical reviews continued. Victoria Langford signed the message personally, noting that the association welcomed professional evaluation whenever questions involved drainage or public infrastructure. Reading those words, I could not help noticing how dramatically the conversation had shifted. Only weeks earlier, engineering concerns had been dismissed as outside the scope of the issue. Now those same concerns had become central to understanding what had actually happened. As I stood beside the creek that evening watching the water move steadily through its new course, I realized the investigation was no longer focused on me or my property. It had become an effort to understand an entire system that had quietly served the community for decades. And for the first time since receiving that original notice, I believed the right questions were finally being asked. About 2 weeks after the county engineers first visited my property, Laura Jenkins called and asked whether I could attend a technical review meeting at the county offices. She explained that the investigation had reached the point where historical records, modern survey data, and recent field observations could finally be compared side by side. I arrived carrying the same storage box that had followed me through every stage of this situation, although by then I suspected I would not need most of it. The engineering team had already assembled an impressive collection of documents from county archives, historical aerial photographs, drainage maintenance logs, and topographic surveys dating back decades. What immediately stood out was not a single dramatic discovery, but the consistency of the evidence. Every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. The earthen dam that once crossed my section of the creek had functioned as one component within a much larger drainage network that gradually developed as surrounding properties changed over time. It was never intended to hold back an entire river, and nobody claimed it served that purpose. Instead, it slowed runoff, reduced peak flow during ordinary storms, and helped distribute water through a pattern the surrounding landscape had adapted to over many years. Laura explained that removing one element from a mature drainage system does not automatically create disaster, but it does change how water behaves. The recent rainfall had demonstrated exactly that. Measurements collected before and after the excavation confirmed increased flow velocity in several locations, earlier runoff concentration in downstream channels, and new areas of minor erosion that had not appeared in comparable historical inspections. None of those findings suggested a catastrophic failure. They did, however, establish that the structure had been performing a meaningful hydrological function before its removal. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of relief rather than satisfaction. I had never wanted anyone to prove that I was right. I simply wanted someone qualified to examine the facts before irreversible decisions were made. A few days later, the Homeowners Association announced a special community meeting. Residents filled the clubhouse more quickly than I had ever seen before. Victoria Langford stood at the front of the room wearing another colorful designer outfit, although this time her confident posture seemed noticeably more restrained. When the meeting began, she thanked everyone for attending and acknowledged the county's cooperation throughout the engineering review. Then she did something I genuinely had not expected. She explained that the board had relied too heavily on architectural compliance without fully understanding the historical drainage role of the structure that had existed on my property. She emphasized that the association had acted in good faith based on the information available to it at the time, but she also recognized that important technical questions should have been asked before enforcement moved forward. The room remained completely quiet while she spoke. Nobody interrupted. Nobody celebrated. Several county representatives summarized the engineering findings using simple diagrams that residents could easily understand. They carefully avoided assigning blame and instead focused on how historical infrastructure can quietly influence modern neighborhoods long after its original purpose has faded from public memory. Their presentation reinforced something I had believed since the beginning. Good engineering depends on curiosity as much as calculation. Asking why something exists is often just as important as deciding whether it should remain. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached me to thank me for preserving so many records instead of reacting emotionally. Harold smiled, shook my hand, and admitted he was glad someone had finally looked beyond appearances. Even Michael Turner stopped by later that afternoon and remarked that careful documentation had probably saved everyone years of speculation about what had actually happened. Before leaving the clubhouse, Victoria walked over and quietly apologized for dismissing the engineering concerns too quickly. I thanked her for saying so and replied that every community benefits when questions come before conclusions. She nodded thoughtfully and said the association had already begun drafting new procedures requiring outside technical consultation whenever future compliance issues involve drainage, retaining structures, or older property features with possible public impact. Driving home that evening, I passed the familiar stretch of creek where everything had started. The landscape looked peaceful again, yet I understood it differently than I had only a month earlier. The greatest lesson was never about a homeowners association, a compliance notice, or even an old earthen dam. It was about how easily visible appearances can overshadow invisible systems until someone takes the time to understand both. Several months have passed since those meetings, and when I walk across my property today, I find myself looking at the landscape a little differently than I did before everything happened. The county eventually completed its review and worked with local officials to recommend several practical improvements throughout the drainage corridor. Some channels were reinforced, additional monitoring points were established, and future maintenance procedures were updated so historical records would remain connected to modern planning instead of being forgotten over time. Those changes were not dramatic, and that was probably the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. Good infrastructure rarely attracts attention when it functions properly. The Homeowners Association also followed through on the commitments made during the community meeting. New review procedures required outside technical consultation whenever questions involved drainage features, retaining structures, or other property elements that could influence neighboring land beyond simple appearance standards. It was a sensible policy, and I sincerely believed it would help prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Victoria Langford and I crossed paths several times after everything settled. Our conversations were polite, professional, and noticeably different from the first meeting we shared. She remained committed to maintaining community standards, but she also became much more willing to ask questions before reaching conclusions. In fairness, I changed as well. I learned that even when evidence seems overwhelming, presenting it with patience accomplishes far more than presenting it with frustration. Looking back now, I realize this story was never really about a $400 fee, a single homeowners association decision, or even an old earthen dam. It was about how easily people can mistake something quiet for something unimportant simply because it has been doing its job for so long that nobody notices it anymore. The structure on my property was not holding back an entire river, and it never needed to. Its real value came from helping regulate ordinary water movement within a local drainage system that had evolved over many decades. That truth may sound less dramatic than the assumptions people first made, but in my experience, reality usually tells the stronger story. During my engineering career, I learned that the most important question is often the simplest one. Before removing anything that has existed for generations, ask why it was built in the first place. Sometimes the answer confirms that change is appropriate. Other times it reveals connections that are not immediately visible. Either way, understanding should always come before action. I still keep the storage box containing every survey, photograph, maintenance log, email, and engineering note from this experience. Most people would probably see an ordinary collection of paperwork. I see a reminder that facts become valuable only when someone is willing to preserve them long enough for the right questions to be asked. Harold still jokes that I probably own the most thoroughly documented creek in Central Texas, and every time he says it we both laugh, because there is a little truth hidden inside the joke. Michael Turner occasionally stops by when he is working nearby, and we still talk about how often careful observation prevents expensive mistakes. Laura Jenkins once emailed me to say that the county had added several historical references from the investigation into its planning files so future engineers would better understand how the drainage system had evolved. Hearing that may have meant more to me than anything else that happened afterward because it meant the knowledge would not disappear again. If there is one lesson I hope remains after this story, it is that patience, careful documentation, and respectful conversation often accomplish more than anger ever could. They may not produce immediate results, but they create the foundation that allows good decisions to emerge when emotions finally settle. I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing everything that happened. If you had been in my position, would you have continued challenging the decision, or would you have made the difficult choice to comply while carefully documenting every step the way I did? Please share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives, and thoughtful discussions often reveal ideas that none of us would have considered alone. If you enjoy character-driven stories about homeowners associations, engineering, community challenges, and the value of staying calm when facing difficult situations, I hope you will consider subscribing so you do not miss future stories. Thank you for spending your time with me, and I truly appreciate you being part of this journey from beginning to end.